Hi, let's talk about neural regulation of the heart, the nervous system, and how it controls much of the heart. So this is a picture of CNS. So what we have here is a picture of the brain stem, but this is the central nervous system. So we're looking at the brain stem. It should be somewhat familiar from last quarter when you looked at the brain. So what I have here are in the brain stem is the midbrain and the pons and the medulla oblongata. And we are going to be working with medulla oblongata primarily. So what I've shown here are several different nuclei. So within the medulla oblongata is this cardiovascular control center, which I tend to abbreviate as CVCC because it's a whole lot easier than spelling out cardiovascular control center, but that's what the CVCC stands for. So it's controlling the heart and the vasculature, the blood vessels. The two together make up the cardiovascular system. So this is the center in the brain, in the medulla, that controls it. And I've circled it with a little blue oval here. This is the cardiovascular control center. And inside that cardiovascular control center are several nuclei. And you remember that the definition in this context of a nucleus is a collection or a group of cell bodies inside the CNS. So there are three of these nuclei that are relevant to what we're talking about. So one of these is the vasomotor center, and this is the vascular smooth muscle. So it's part of the sympathetic system that delivers sympathetic fibers to the vascular smooth muscle, which maintains sort of tonic or constant contraction of the muscle on the vascular wall. So the idea is that the blood vessels, the smooth muscle that is in the walls of the blood vessel, is always under some degree of constriction. And we refer to that as sort of tonic control. There's a certain degree of muscle tone on the vascular walls. And that's constantly maintained by these sympathetic fibers that are originating in this cardiovascular control center. So that's the vasomotor center. Another center, another nucleus in the cardiovascular control center is the cardioacceleratory center. So it's like stepping on the accelerator, stepping on the gas for the heart. These are sympathetic pathways that are going to the SA node and the AV node in the heart. And when those pathways are stimulated more than normal, it increases the heart rate and the force of contraction, and that leads to increased cardiac output. So we're speeding the heart up, our sympathetic response. So that's the accelerator for the heart, and then the inhibitor, cardioinhibitory center, is the third one. And this is parasympathetic. We're slowing the heart down. So these are fibers that are running in the vagus nerve, cranial nerve number 10, to the SA node, which slows the heart rate down. So that's the brakes for the heart. And the next figure that we're going to go through is related to that, and we'll just draw in the neurotransmitters and the receptors. You should have been introduced to this in A&P1. So let's go through this together. And what I want you to pay attention to is this material. This is important. So I want you to remember that you have adrenergic receptors and you have cholinergic receptors. Adrenergic is referring to adrenaline or epinephrine. So the types of adrenergic receptors are beta 1, which we'll see on the heart, beta 2s, among other places, we'll see those on the lungs, we'll get to that, and then alpha receptors. And alpha receptors are the most common, and those we will put on blood vessels. So this is important, so make little flashcards if you have to, print this slide out and practice it again until it makes sense, and it should be review. Should come back to you. So let's go through this together. So we're looking at the neural wiring, if you will, from the CNS to the heart. So let's do the parasympathetic pathways first. Now you know that in the brain stem is the medulla and the cardiovascular control center. I'm not going to draw that again. We've already gone over it. You know that it's there. You know how it functions. So let's just keep this simple. And we'll put a nucleus here. And this is going to be a cranial nerve. It's going to leave the cranium through an opening. It's going to be parasympathetic. And we'll draw it, I don't know, maybe this far. If you remember that on parasympathetic pathways, this is all autonomic. And all autonomic pathways are 2-neuron pathways. So there's the first neuron. And this is the cranial nerve number 10, which is the vagus. Note how you spell it. It's not like Las Vegas. And this is parasympathetic. We'll come back to that. And here, let's draw this as our second neuron. That cell body that I'm drawing is in the ganglion. So this is the postganglionic axon. And we'll get it close to the heart, but I need a little bit of room to draw. And on the heart, for the parasympathetic nervous system, is a receptor. And if we look at the bottom picture, we need a cholinergic receptor. And this is going to be a muscarinic, and so it doesn't matter what kind of drawing you put here, or symbol rather. So I'm going to call this a muscarinic receptor. It's a cholinergic receptor. Muscarinic. I'm not sure if that is readable or not. Let's try it again. Muscarinic receptor. Okay, so let's start back at our first axon terminal, and this is releasing acetylcholine, ACH, and it binds to you remember the type of receptor? It's going to be cholinergic. This one was a nicotinic receptor. So it's ACH onto a nicotinic receptor. Supposed to be an arrowhead. And the signal then goes to the postganglionic axon, and it also releases ACH. So this is pretty easy for the parasympathetic, because all parasympathetic fibers release acetylcholine. And then all we have to do is note the response on the heart when this pathway dominates, or when it becomes more active than normal. So the response is to decrease the heart rate at the SA node. And we looked at the action potential on the SA node in an earlier lecture. And it's basically the amount of time to reach threshold is increased. Those sodium leakage channels are less permeable, so it takes a longer time to reach threshold. But let's keep going with this topic. So that takes care of the parasympathetic pathway. You remember that it is originating from the cardioinhibitory center in the medulla. The sympathetic pathways, they leave from the thoracolumbar region of the spinal cord, not through cranial nerves, through sort of the midpoint of the spinal cord. And the first neuron in sympathetic pathways is generally short, and the ganglion is close to the spinal cord. You probably remember the paravertebral ganglia or the sympathetic chain ganglia. That's where this cell body would be located. And the postganglionic neuron is generally quite long. So let's do a branch going to the myocardium and another branch going to the AV node. I need a little more room to draw. And then another branch going to the SA node. So let's start at the beginning, close to the spinal cord. So again, coming out of the first motor neuron, in all cases, all motor neurons leaving the CNS are releasing ACH. And that held true for somatic muscle from last quarter. And it's the same picture as with the parasympathetic and with skeletal muscle. ACH binds to a nicotinic receptor. The signal travels down the postganglionic neuron to the heart, and the neurotransmitter that is released from the postganglionic neuron, these are, give you a hint, these are adrenergic neurons. So they release adrenaline, or epinephrine, norepinephrine. In this case, they're releasing norepinephrine. Okay, so it's NE, norepinephrine, that is released. And then the receptor. Well, it has to be an adrenergic receptor, and on the heart, these were the beta 1s. So we have beta 1 receptors on the, this is representing the contractile myocardium. Myocardial muscle. That's where the beta 1 receptors are on those cardiac muscle cells. On the AV node and the SA node, also it's beta 1. So if you wanted to draw a little receptor in there, you could. It makes the drawing a little bit crowded. As long as you know that the beta 1 receptor is on the AV node cells and the SA node cells, we're good. So those are beta 1 also. So on the heart, it's norepinephrine binding to beta 1. And the response, this is sympathetic, you know, is to increase the heart rate and the force of contraction. Increase heart rate, and we already abbreviated force of contraction as FOC. And that will lead to an increase in the cardiac output, which is consistent with a sympathetic response. So those neurotransmitters and receptors you should know. They're important. Drug interactions work on the receptors, bind receptors, or stimulate the receptors. So it's important that you understand where the nicotinic and adrenergic receptors are and the difference between them. So work on that. I would probably practice this. I would print out this page and I would practice again. Print and practice until you can do it from memory. It's not hard, it just takes time. The other thing that we could include on this, since we have the diagram up, is to put in the adrenal glands. So let's just draw a simple kidney down here, maybe something like this. Here's a ureter, and let's draw a rather large adrenal gland. Cortex on the outer portion, adrenal medulla in the center, so better label that. Adrenal gland, and the adrenal glands are named because they release adrenaline. So there's the adrenal cortex, which released steroid hormones from last quarter, and the adrenal medulla that released catecholamines, norepinephrine and epinephrine. So let's draw a sympathetic neuron going to it. It's just one neuron here. The second one is actually buried inside, which we don't worry about. So that's another sympathetic fiber. And then coming out of the adrenal medulla is what? Primarily epinephrine and some norepinephrine. The epinephrine is about 80%. About 20% of what comes out of the adrenal medulla is norepinephrine. So it's primarily the epinephrine. But they both work the same way. And these then travel through the blood. They're hormones. So they go into the blood. And they travel through the blood. And they bind to all adrenergic receptors that they come to. So bind all adrenergic receptors. And which adrenergic receptors are we talking about in this story? Right, it would be the beta 1s, and that's all we have in this picture. That's enough, otherwise we're going to get it crowded. But they also bind to the alpha receptors on the vascular smooth muscle, and all of that increases the blood pressure. So you get excited, spooked, you dump adrenaline into the blood. Adrenaline is epinephrine, and that raises the blood pressure and heart rate, which is good for acute stress. Let's go to the next page, the next and last slide in this section. And all I really want to point out here are other factors that can influence the heart rate and cardiac output. So things like fever, elevated fever, or sepsis. And sepsis is bacteria in the blood or poisoning of the blood, bacterial poisoning of the blood. And that will cause the heart rate to become elevated. Somebody with a high fever, or an infant, a child with a high fever, is likely to have an elevated heart rate. And hypoxia will also cause the heart rate to increase. And hypoxia is lack of oxygen, insufficient oxygen delivered to the tissues, and that is detected in the central chemoreceptors, both central and peripheral. Central in the CNS, peripheral in the peripheral nervous system. And sepsis and fever were detected in the brainstem, primarily in the medulla. So, just as an aside, what else could you think of for normal body responses if a patient was suffering from hypoxia? So in other words, how would the body respond? What might you see? So it detects that there's not enough oxygen being delivered. So what would make sense for the body to get more oxygen delivered to the tissues? Well, one thing would be to increase the heart rate, increase the blood flow, which delivers oxygen. So that makes sense. If you don't have enough oxygen getting to the tissues, send more blood, increase the heart rate. And how do you get more oxygen into the blood? Through the respiratory system. So typically you would find an elevated respiratory rate. Those would be consistent with hypoxia. So they're breathing more quickly. Part of the vital signs that you would be taking on a patient. If they were suffering from hypoxia, you'd take the pulse, and you'd also record the respiration rate along with other things. So at any rate, those two sort of make sense as logical responses of the body to hypoxia. The other thing that I have on this figure is part of these other factors that influence heart rate and cardiac output are higher brain centers, higher functioning. Things like fear. Somebody gets spooked, an animal gets spooked, and their heart rate goes up. Anxiety, stress, anticipation will all tend to increase heart rate. And you know, the anticipation might not be bad. Maybe you're an athlete and you're getting ready to run a fast, short race. Well, it's typical for the blood pressure and the heart rate to increase before you ever start running, just because you know that you're going to have to, or the brain knows. Relaxation sort of mental state, yoga, relaxing, can lower the heart rate. If you lower the heart rate, you can lower the blood pressure. If you increase the heart rate, you're likely to be increasing the blood pressure. So just some other factors to think about and remember. And that's it. We're almost near the end of this unit on the heart. So one more unit to go. See you then.